Welcome back to an episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have James Perloff back on the show. James, of course, is an author, independent researcher. He's authored Shadows of Power, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, and the most recently, Exploding the Official Myth of the Lincoln Assassination. His website is jamesperloff.net. James, how are you doing this evening?
Well, I'm doing real good. I was very delighted that you asked me to come on the show. We did a pretty recent one in March on the controversy at the Academy Awards over the way Quo Vadis was received versus Ben-Hur for political and religious reasons. But tonight we'll be tackling a totally different subject.
It's kind of fun. I was at work and one of the younger guys came in. This was a few weeks ago, maybe about a month ago during Lent. And he said, I just watched Ben-Hur. He goes, that's very Jewish. And he
Right. Well, that was the main reason why it received 11 out of 12 Oscars, while Quo Vadis got 0 out of 8. Quo Vadis was about the persecution of Christians, and Ben-Hur was about the persecution, of course, of a Jewish family. And this is in spite of the fact that they had the same studio, the same producer, the same music. Um, Composer, some of the same actors, and the quality of Quo Vadis, most costumes made in history, and yet it didn't even win the best um, uh, movie history. I mean, of course, it didn't even win the costume design. But anyway, people can watch it. It's quite ironic, and I had a blog post on it that led to our interview on that.
Yeah, and this guy happened to mention also that hey, did you ever see Quo Vadis? So I was able to talk because I remember doing our show. I was able to talk a little about the politics behind it. It was
Yeah.
rather I guess serendipitous. But anyway, tonight I have you back on to discuss an article that you wrote maybe a week ago, a couple weeks ago. It was titles Why Trump's Tariff Measures Likely Spell Disaster for America, and the truth about it isn't simplistic. And you get into the issue of tariffs and free trade, and perhaps the ulterior motives of those advocating free trade in the 20th century, and of course in the 21st century, as a sort of a cover for globalism and violating sovereignty, and also the ability to I guess, immiserate the working class of America, deindustrialize, and leverage or exploit the cheap labor around the world. Often, people suffering under, authoritarian or communist regimes, and but how it isn't what it's really marketed to be. And of course, we haven't gotten what we were told it would. We were told NAFTA and other free trade arrangements like the World Trade Organization would bring in a glorious, future of universal
Right.
prosperity. Yeah, hasn't quite worked out that way. Surprise, surprise, right? So I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah. Actually, I encountered story. This is how the story begins. I encountered a mystery when I was researching the Shadows of Power, which is history of the Council of Foreign Relations, and we didn't call it the deep state in those days. We called it the establishment. And by the way, I should just mention the John Burchett is coming out with a commemorative edition of that book, which they're going to be marketing quite hard. Got a new cover, a new forward, and they've even sent me a new publishing contract. So it's still continuing to do well after 37 years. Um, but when I was researching that book, found something very interesting and mysterious. Because there was no internet at that time, no such thing as a search engine, so all my research was done through paper resources. And I sat in the Boston Public Library. I went through every issue of Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, which of course is the organization that basically connected the deep state to the federal government and supplying cabinet level personnel. And I wanted to know their history. I want to know what they were thinking and what they had been planning over the decades. And I started in 1922, moved forward. Now, the mysterious thing I encountered was that they were always advocating free trade. In fact, for many years, I don't know how many years it was. It could have been 10, 20, maybe. Every issue of Foreign Affairs on the rear cover would have a picture of a roller coaster It's the same picture and it had the same blurb. It was advocating free trade. And the reason that this was mysterious to me was that in the John Birch Society, we were also advocating free trade, just like David Rockefeller and the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, normally we were always against them on any issue, like whether it was, the UN, globalism, depopulation, whatever they were advocating, we're against it. But in this case, we're totally on the same page. So I was working on the research department of the John Birch Society at the time, and I asked around, said, how come David Rockefeller and us, we both want the same thing? That seems kind of contradictory. And people didn't have an answer for me, and they sort of thought, well, I mean, nobody used a specific phrase, but their belief was just kind of like a broken clock is right twice a day. They just kind of goofed on this one, but I didn't believe that because I knew these people were very sharp and they had a definite plan, that they were a definite agenda that they were undertaking. And the man who cleared up for me, I really have to give him full credit, was William J. Gill. Now, he was a outstanding activist and conservative journalist. His first book came out in 1970 when I was just a freshman in college. And it was The Ordeal of Otto Otepka. It was a great book. It talked about the behind the scenes maneuverings that the deep state undertook to get rid of Otto Otepka, who was in charge of security for the State Department. And well, they specifically got rid of him to get one man into the State Department. That was Walt Rostow, who Otepka had rejected 3 times as a security risk. Um, Gail told me that the Rostows were known as the Red Rostows in their hometown. Two of his aunts, Walt Rostow's aunts, were members of the U.S. Communist Party. And yet he authored a paper, well, with one other man, he co-authored a paper that led President Kennedy to send the first 10,000 U.S. troops to Vietnam in 1961. And this became a whole trend of people who were pro-communist wanting the Vietnam War. Great example uh, would be the guy who wrote the Tonkin Gulf um, resolution, William P. Bundy. Um, he wrote the resolution before the Tonkin Gulf incident even took place. And yet, back in the 50s, he was head of the Alger Hiss Defense Fund.
That was
Alger Hiss was a
McGeorge Bundy's
communist
brother,
spy.
right? Wasn't he the
Yeah,
brother of McGeorge Bundy?
yeah, that's right.
Okay,
And his
so
father-in-law was Dean Acheson, who
hmm
Joseph Stalin had hired when Acheson was a young attorney to represent the Soviet Union's interest in America. Yet Acheson led a group of secret 14 advisors called the Wise Men, who insisted to President Johnson to escalate the war in Vietnam. These guys wanted the war, even though they were pro-communist,
didn't he also
and they
give
had no intention. They had no intention of winning it.
he also seemed to give North Korea the green light to invade in 1950 when he said in the winter of 1950 that that Korea was outside the United States security.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. The Korean and um, Vietnam conflicts are very, very interesting areas to go into. But to get back to tonight's topic, William J. Gill published a book in 1990 called Trade Wars in America.
I
With
think the point why you pointed this out is you have ostensibly you have maybe perhaps a red diaper baby, a child of communist being installed in the U.S. government, and it's just, of course, the suspicion that he himself is indeed a communist. He's Jewish, and as many Jews were communist, comes out and he's promoting the Vietnam War. Or you have someone like a Cold Warrior like Dean Acheson, who is a lawyer for the Soviet interest in the United States in the 1930s, handpicked. Then he's the Secretary of State who
Yeah,
leads the charge into Korea, the police action, right? That was a
and
multinational effort, right? Globalism. And so these things just don't really make sense given the dialectic we're supposed to accept, meaning, capitalist versus communist, free world versus, the communist world. So,
absolutely.
yeah.
Um, yeah, you find that uh, the 2 times we fight wars against communism, Korea and Vietnam, both done for their own purposes. they had no intention of letting us win those wars. And that's why so much restraint was put on the soldiers, which was never seen in World War II, where it was absolutely unrestrained. But that would make a great topic. Either of those wars would make a great topic for a show.
Yeah, I think we talked about Korea several years ago.
Or we probably did.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, Mr. Gill sent me a copy in 1990 of his book Trade Wars Against America, and that clarified this whole mystery of why not just the John Birch Society, but many conservatives and free market economists were aligned with David Rockefeller and the Council on Foreign Relations and the deep state about this subject of free trade. And I was very grateful to him. My wife and I were honored to have him as a guest in our home. Um, so let me just go over a couple of things. First, why it was that the conservatives favored free trade, and then why it was that David Rockefeller and the deep state favored free trade, and it was for totally different reasons. So if you look first at the conservatives, they were operating off the principles laid out by Adam Smith in his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations, coming up on the 250th anniversary of that book's publication. And Smith, argued that basically people and countries should freely trade with each other without interference from government, and made the assumption that products cost would be based on the efficiency of whoever made it. So free market economists would say something like this: well, suppose an American makes a product and it sells for $10 each. Then an ingenious Scotsman comes up with a better way, more efficient way of making the same product, and he can sell it for $8 a piece. They said it'd be very foolish to punish the Scotsman's ingenuity with a tariff, which would make it more expensive for Americans to buy this import, and would be propping up the inefficiency of the American producer. This just didn't seem to make any sense to have tariffs in such situations. However, after Adam Smith, a number of conditions arose that he had not foreseen, and I'm going to go over three of them. One was the arrival of communism and socialist states. And in America, a person's wages would be set by a number of factors: the market, the person's skills and qualifications, how productive he was at his job, how prosperous the company was that he worked for, the demand for the product and that existed. Free market conditions would determine his salary. But in communist states, the state would set the salary, and usually very low. They would gulags that would make nothing at all. But you also had people who we might call virtual slave laborers who were making next to nothing and got no benefits compared to American workers. So this made foreign imports very cheap. And another factor, which was quite significant, was that in America, we enacted quite a few safety regulations and pollution regulations. My wife works for a church as its chief administrator, and she has to deal with regulators all the time. They come in to check the fire equipment and the kitchen safety and the elevators safety, and if they get any deficiencies, the church has to hire a contractor to come in to fix the deficiency, which can be quite expensive. And this, of course, applies to American businesses. However, in a place like China, they don't care about safety. They don't care about pollution. And so since they're not dealing with these expenses, this again makes their products safety and cheaper, excuse me. And Mr. Gill pointed out another factor, which was that our socialist competitors would often subsidize their industries. Now, a subsidized product will be a lot cheaper when it comes to the American market. Now, this does cause that other countries it costs their taxpayers something to have to pay for that subsidy. But if they can make the product cheap enough to wipe out the American industrial competitor, it's worth their while to do that. Now, these were factors that Adam Smith had not foreseen, but in the eyes of free market economists, they had not caught on to this. And they said, well, um, why shouldn't people have the freedom to choose the cheapest product? That's, people should have freedom. And they actually misinterpreted tariffs in quotas, which are restrictions on the number of goods that come in from a foreign country. They said, well, that's socialism. That's the government's interfering with the free marketplace. But actually, it was protecting the free enterprise. It was keeping socialist goods out of our country or restricting them and protecting our industrial base, which was the basis of our wealth, in which actually it was the founding fathers who uh, set up tariffs in the first place. And that was why we thrived as a nation and were able to establish our industries so well, was because we had tariffs. Now, in addition to the
This would
mistake of
be
calling, go ahead. Yeah.
Hamilton's report on manufacturers.
Oh, well, I'm not even familiar with that.
Well, that was the idea of protecting infant industries from predatory British goods,
Oh,
cheap goods, and
sure.
Hamilton had had a dual personality on this matter, because while he was supporting, protecting domestic industries to grow the American domestic market, he also advocated the U.S. Bank, which was a usurious predatory financial operation. So it's kind of, but that's America right there.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
a lot of the founding fathers had two sides to them,
Mhm.
that's for sure. A lot of them had a Freemasonic side that was never mentioned in the uh, standard history books. But there was one other thing that I heard a lot from free market economists that was not true, but I still hear it all the time. They would say that a tariff is a tax on Americans. That makes you pay more for goods that you want to buy from foreign countries. Well, actually, we had no income tax in this country until 1913. So how did America survive? It survived on primarily on tariffs, and the
Mm.
tariffs were quite high in the 19th century. Typically up around, you know, 45% was not untypical at all. And there was no such thing as an income tax, which was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1895. Now, all this changed in 1913 with the Revenue Act, which anybody can look up just on Wikipedia, and will show you that not only did the Revenue Act of 1913 introduce the income tax, but at the same time, it substantially reduced tariffs. So basically, income tax, which is a direct tax, replaced tariffs. With tariffs, you've got a choice. You can still buy that cheaper American good instead of paying for the foreign good. With
Mhm.
income tax, you've got no choice at all. And as you know, of course, Tim, and as our listeners know, since 1913, the income tax, which started out as 1%, was 1% of your income for salaries up to $20,000, which very few people made in those days. $20,000 was a lot of money back in
Mhm.
1913, huge amount of money. Um, and okay, of course, today people are in much higher income tax brackets, and of course, the inflation from the Federal Reserve pushes people into higher brackets. At the same time, while income tax rates were going up, tariff rates were going down to the delight of um, uh, people running factories in foreign countries. And so, under by the time we reach the Biden administration, you see that if you buy a laptop or a smartphone from a foreign country, that the tariff is less than 5%. Um, on food, it's as low as 2%. On maybe wait a minute, I should check it. But anyway, it's well below 10%, around the 5 to 2% range for food, clothing, electronics, things of that nature. Some things related to national security are higher, but very, very low tariff rates and high tax rates on Americans. So it's incorrect to say that a tariff is a tax on Americans.
It also it tends a tariff would encourage savings, because you could say makes consumption more expensive, which would encourage a less profligate society. Consumerism, and whereas income tax is a tax on income, of course, what you earn, and I don't think it wasn't until 1943 that most Americans even paid income tax. That's when
That's probably true.
that's when they started
Um,
withholding. So
Right. That, yeah, they introduced the withholding tax, which gave you, it used to be originally that you would fill out, you pay your income tax, I forget whether it was quarterly, I forget how often it was, but you would pay it yourself. It was not withheld from your income automatically by your um, employer. So you can see how the government has gradually oppressed the economy of Americans by introducing these things. Um, I see. I'm looking it up. Clothing tariffs range between 2 and 10%. That's still very low. Um, I should also mention that if an industry is wiped out by foreign competitors, if you don't have a job, you can't even afford to buy those cheap foreign goods either. The tariffs were designed to protect our industry and our American way of life, which we've seen steadily decline over the years. Well, I also want to take a look at why it was that David Rockefeller, the Council of Foreign Relations, and the deep state wanted free trade, and it was not for the reasons that the conservatives and free market economists favored free trade. They had a totally different reason. Number
it,
one,
yeah, but it's
the,
an interesting point that I think you alluded to is that in the reality, when people are able to outsource and send factories overseas, they're exploiting poor people in like places like China or
right,
Southeast Asia or the subcontinent of Asia, where they suffer under very I guess difficult working conditions. They don't have the environmental regulations. So basically, those are the externalities. We're just exporting all that misery abroad to get cheap, manufactured goods imported that we just buy with our dollars, and it's become part of this global economic system, which is proven to be, I think, unsustainable, which is why we're having so much trouble now. And basically, you have governments and uh, capitalists, if you will, in the West, like Rockefeller and that ilk, who are happy to exploit um, surplus labor in Latin America or in China because they don't want to pay the higher wages in the United States, and so again, that's why those goods are ostensibly cheaper. Not to mention the quality issues that inevitably develop. But what happens is those costs are borne by the people who are working in the factories, and at the same time, it's also borne by the people who are thrown out of work in the United States. So we're deprived manufacturing jobs that can be the basis for a middle class or a upper or working class or middle class wage. Then they go and then they spend that money in the community, and they support schools and these things. And again, it's a way, when the capitalist system, when manufacturers are forced to deal with a relatively static labor pool and also geographically static, meaning that people aren't as mobile, they have to come to terms and with labor units and pay higher wages, and so they're forced to just to share and distribute the wealth
right.
through a controlled marketplace. Whereas you can just access and leverage humanity, then you can just exploit the slave labor abroad and report larger quarterly profits as the industrial base, the productive capacity, and the society of your home country deteriorate, and your country disintegrates. But since you're a cosmopolitan globalist, you have no loyalty to your country. So you don't see
Right.
yourself as investing in the country. So there's no longer any national economy anymore. That's part of which is why globalism is the antithesis to national economy. That type of system. So
You, you're absolutely right. And of course, at one time, we had a much larger middle class. I even seen that quantified, but there was a time, as you know, back in the 50s when a man could work one job, his wife could stay at home, take care of the kids, and he could still afford his own home and have a couple of cars all on one job. And of course, when American industry was dismantled, um, all of that came um, to a halt, a gradual halt over the years. It's
and
interesting. One of
it's
the things,
also interesting to point out these corporations, these companies that eventually would outsource and deindustrialize the country. They learned all this in Harvard Business School and at Carnegie Mellon. Why not just make everything cheaper abroad and ship it back in, right? And use the with our strong dollar policy, with with the petrodollar. Well, we'll see the cost of that, because then your domestic, not only does your domestic economy fall apart, but your society disintegrates. And you mentioned that era when a man could earn a wage and support his family, and the wife is taking care of the kids, raising the kids and providing a stable environment, therefore providing a stable community. You were creating a much healthier. And what dollar value do you put on that? You may show higher GDP growth under the globalist system, but
Mhm.
that GDP doesn't mean anything if wealth is being concentrated higher up, and you get a huge wealth gap. Then you're creating societal instability. You know, so
Um, this is absolutely true. One of the things that Mr. Gill um, pointed out in his book was that up until the time of World War II, 98% of the products Americans bought were made right here in America. In
mhm.
other words, we're quite capable of being self-sufficient. Now, naturally, there are some countries that may have mineral resources that we don't have access to. We have to import those, but basically, America was self-sufficient um, at one time, and again, that gave us uh, a tremendous uh, industrial base and a tremendous standard of living for Americans across the board in the middle class. Um, well, I was going to mention why David Rockefeller and his cronies wanted this, and you've already mentioned one, which is that they wanted to use this cheap labor overseas to profit themselves at the expense of American workers. And another factor was this, as you know, the deep state wants a world government in the end, and the Council of Foreign Relations was advocating the world government since its first issues of Foreign Affairs, their journal in 1922. And again, if we did you mentioned we did a show on the Korean War, and that was the idea of the Korean War was to uh, empower the UN as the world's peacekeeper. You know, even though Americans did 90% of the fighting in the Korean War, they had many contingents from other countries, and they wanted to make it look like a UN operation. It was officially a UN war, and the UN, of course, had just been established in 1945, and they uh, they believed what they could do was to gradually empower the UN and turn it into a world government. However, that was not succeeding because countries regarded it as an infringement on their national sovereignty. The UN wasn't happening. So in 1974, in the Journal of Foreign Affairs, Richard and Gardner wrote an article that outlined a new strategy. The article was called The Hard Road to World Order. And here's what he said, quote, "We are witnessing an outbreak of short-sighted nationalism that seems oblivious to the economic, political, and moral implications of interdependence. The House of World Order will have to be built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. An end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault." End quote. So what he's saying here is that we're not going to create world government in just one stroke. What we're going to do is we build it brick by brick. So you can have it built in parts. For example, a regional alliance like the European Union, the World Health Organization, environmental agreements like the Kyoto Protocol. Now, of course, we have climate agreements. I did a article a couple of years ago on the whole climate change folks, and the spokesman for the World Economic Forum was saying, the French spokesman who was saying that Europe cannot be first, America cannot be first, China cannot be first, climate must be first. In other words, all the nations of the world must work together on climate, another building block of the end game of world government. Of course, Klaus Schwab's World Economic Forum is part of that too. They act as a policy making, policy influencing institution that supplies cabinet level personnel to countries around the world. But in terms of trade, uh, building blocks were to be NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was a stepping stone, intended to be a stepping stone towards America becoming a North American Union, just like the common market had and turned into the EU. They take an economic alliance and then turn it into a political alliance. It didn't work out for the North American Union. It may in the future, but all of these things, uh, these trade agreements, NAFTA, and then subsequently the GATT treaty, that stands for General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and that evolved into the World Trade Organization. These were also building blocks of world government. Um, but the other motive, and you've basically already touched on this, but the other motive was America, as we were saying, had a very healthy, vibrant economy, and a nation that has such an economy is difficult to incorporate into a world government. Therefore, they sought to derail American industry by, Mr. Gill called it a tidal wave of cheap foreign imports. They would destroy American industry, and that required raising uh, our tariffs and our trade quotas. And that's where NAFTA came, and where the World Trade Organization came, and those were signed into law in 1993 and 1994. And there's some interesting debates that I want to touch on, but let me throw it back to you.
Yeah, that whole I guess the post Bretton Woods system, because although Bretton Woods was established in 1944, the design was provided by Harry Dexter White, who was
Right.
a communist agent, and also
Correct.
John Maynard Keynes, who was a Fabian
Oh,
socialist. Um, but the idea is that put the dollar as the de facto world reserve currency. That lasted till roughly the early 1970s, when it collapsed because of all the spending in the 1960s. But even then, it was too much of a, I guess, of a stricture for those who wanted to inflate and go into debt. And Nixon closes the gold window in 71, and a couple years later, you have the fiat, the petrodollar, in the wake of the Arab-Israeli the Yom Kippur War, which is a pretext for the oil shocks, which also coincides with Nixonger's Nixonger, I like that. Nixonger.
that's a
Kissinger,
good one, Nixonger. I'll remember. We'll
Nixonger.
have to write that down.
That's a mistake, but yeah, Nixonger. There you go. The Kissinger's National Security Study Memorandum 200, which called for the sort of the immiseration of the third world, which was then developing, and therefore, in his eyes, putting, I guess, competing for resources. And basically, the oil shocks were a good way to throw them into debt, cause mass starvation, also impose population control measures on them as a contingency for food aid and other aid, IMF contingencies and these things. They're just, as part of the economic hitman model that characterized Western economic relations with the third world for many decades. Again, all done ostensibly under development and aid. It's all corrupt because basically the third world, dictators steal the money. The people never see
Right.
it. The country goes into
That's
debt,
right.
and its resources are sold off as collateral. That model. But the idea is this creates a situation, at least a macroeconomic environment, where Rockefeller and the trilateralists and CFR can now, after China has been conditioned under Mao, and Rockefeller was an advocate. Rockefeller, the arch capitalist, was a big advocate of Chairman Mao and his efforts in China. Because that destabilized China, that set China up in the late 1970s and 80s to what it is now, because that's when they started outsourcing, and you had all this technology and resources going to China to build these factories to exploit then all the surplus labor,
Right.
that model that we alluded to earlier. And so, China can build everything for us, and we can just, I guess, become financial analysts, because the U.S. economy becomes overly financialized, and you have the fire economy. And this creates this is a very corrupting, decadent, I guess, decadence supporting system, because no longer are you working, producing things. You're engaged in financialization, various schemes and employment things. They don't really produce anything of any real value other than, of flipping real estate or engaging in financial schemes. And this totally retards the U.S. economy, and it has long-standing social effects too. A lot of it's because much of our fire economy provides gainful but false employment to women, and this also coincides with the development of feminism and the flooding
Right.
of the labor market of women because which lowered wages. So then men couldn't support families anymore. At the same time, women are becoming, quote, economically independent of men, which it's a false independence because it's ultimately based on the productivity that men provide. But it's at this point it becomes it's because abstracted in various corporations and social programs and universities and this and this ultimately is leading to the depopulation of the country because women simply don't want to have children anymore. They'd rather simply have careers, or they think they're forced to have careers. At the same time, they're not psychologically, at least the equality agenda brought about by feminism and as supported by so many federal programs, education programs, sort of just the cultural force, of entertainment, everything. Women can do anything men can do. It makes women think they no longer need men anymore,
Right.
and so if women don't need men anymore, they really aren't attracted to men anymore. That's kind of how it works, you know. And so you have the birth dearth in the West, and this is what's funny is you see this everywhere. Anywhere there's an advanced capitalist economy, and a lot of it is decadence. You saw the same thing in late stage Roman Empire too. It comes with decadence as people come further removed from reality, and this is sort of the advanced economies, urban living, the simulacrum of the internet. They become divorced from reality, and on comes degeneracy and perversion. And it's a phenomenon, maybe a cyclical thing that occurs in societies. But my point is the generation of, again, the fiat dollar, the petrodollar, and the idea of the U.S. economy being based on financialization as opposed to real work has created a long, widespread corruption throughout American society. Which maybe we talked about earlier, is reversing economic policies isn't going to address the social cost that these economic policies
Definitely.
didn't create, but they definitely promoted for the past 50, 60 years in the country. I know that's a kind of a long-winded, but that's kind of what we're dealing with now, because everything is kind of affected by this. The culture, people's expectations, lifestyles. People have become so divorced from reality. How do you get them to, switch tracks and get back onto a sustainable natural path? It's very difficult.
Right. I'm so glad you said all of that, Tim. I did not address the social aspects of the trade agreements in my article. I'm glad that you
But it
just did.
coincides with promotion of feminism and the
Mhm.
sexual revolution, gay right, all that. It's all, we could just call it decadence, I suppose, right? Make it simple, simplify them, you know. So
Well, I wanted to just again taking this historically, I wanted to talk a little about the NAFTA and GATT debates. NAFTA was signed into law in 1993, and GATT, which meant joining the World Trade Organization. And NAFTA got us into a trade alliance with Canada and Mexico, and GATT, 1 year later, got us into the World Trade Organization, which meant globally there would now be free trade. Now, um, things conflict came kind of ahead in the 1992 presidential elections. Now, in 1992, the Republican candidate, of course, was the incumbent George H.W. Bush, and he was totally pro-NAFTA. He said we'd definitely sign it into law. The Democratic candidate, of course, was Bill Clinton, and perhaps it's not a coincidence that he was at the 1991 Bilderberger meeting.
mhm.
Um, that may have um, definite significance as to his being
It's
selected
also
as the.
interesting with Bill Clinton because people see Bill Clinton as the opponent of George H.W. Bush, of course, in the presidential election. But Bill Clinton, as we been revealed with Iran-Contra, he worked with the Reagan National Security Staff, which is headed by George H.W. Bush in the 80s, and Oliver North, and the Iran-Contra thing, and he helped them, or at least he um, facilitated the use of the Arkansas National Guard in funneling
Right.
weapons and the shipping of cocaine into Arkansas, which also fed into a lot of the development in Arkansas, a lot of the money that the Clintons obviously got their beaks wet in this operation. But again, we talk about we're supposed to believe that Oliver North and George H.W. Bush, these are Republicans, and they're the opponents of the Democrats. But behind, if you behind the scenes are actually working in this so-called national security operation that is funneling cocaine into the country, which is financing this supposed national security operation in Central America. The arming of the Contras. But it's just one of these things. It's you think you have a proper understanding what's going on in this country, and you find out years later that this was going on, and you were at the
Well,
time people got there are hints of it, but it wasn't like reported in the New York Times or the Washington Post, right? Yeah, yeah,
definitely not, because the
yeah.
same forces on both the media and the politicians.
Hmm.
And in addition to that collaboration, you mentioned that, well, George H.W. Bush was totally pro-NAFTA. Bill Clinton, in the presidential debate, said he was totally pro-NAFTA. So you knew that the establishment wanted NAFTA. And unfortunately, the free market conservative economists also were favoring NAFTA. And so it was pretty much looked like a clear path to NAFTA. There were only two significant candidates who opposed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. There were Pat Buchanan, and I know from Mr. Gill that Pat Buchanan was basically schooled in the realities of free trade by Mr. Gill. The other was Ross Perot,
Hmm.
and you can still watch the 1992 presidential debates. NAFTA was a hot topic, and uh, H. George H.W. was there advocating NAFTA. Bill Clinton was advocating NAFTA. Only Ross Perot was there against it. Now, it's quite unfortunate that Pat Buchanan was not allowed to participate in these debates because he was much better schooled in the realities of the free trade argument than what Ross Perot was. See, there's some legitimacy to excluding Pat Buchanan, I suppose, because Ross Perot was running as an independent, and since um, George H.W. Bush had technically won the primaries, that excluded Buchanan. But if he'd been there, he would have been a marvelous spokesman. Now, when I was writing this recent article on tariffs, and including with Trump's tariffs, I still distinctly remembered a debate that took place in 1993. It was between Vice President Al Gore um, and Ross Perot. Al Gore, of course, took the pro-NAFTA side, and Ross Perot was anti-NAFTA.
But this was
And
Larry King, right?
it was CNN, and I don't think Larry King hosted that one, but he might have hosted another one on it.
Okay.
Maybe I got to go back and check. I don't think King, maybe he was the host, but I was paying more attention to the candidates. But you can still watch that debate. I can still distinctly recall how angry I was watching that debate because Ross Perot did not seem to know the most basic arguments against NAFTA and the free trade. Now, he did start off by showing some pictures of Mexican laborers and what poor conditions they worked under American corporations. But I thought to myself, well, that's not going to resonate with Americans. They don't really care that much what's happening with Mexico. They want to know how NAFTA is going to affect Americans. And I was disappointed. Um, Ross Perot held his own, I'll say that much, but he didn't seem to have the best arguments. But Al Gore was extremely articulate and calm, and he was arguing, presented many arguments how um, NAFTA would prosper all nations, Canada, America, and Mexico. And I found that debate on YouTube, and I uh, I noticed something that I had not noticed when I first watched it 30 years ago. Al Gore had a earpiece in his right ear, and he'd been strategically positioned to Ross Perot's right. You can clearly see that Ross Perot does not have an earpiece. Al Gore was not hard of hearing. He didn't need a hearing aid. It was not a hearing aid, but he definitely had a very large earpiece in his right ear. And I looked at that recently, and I said, "Aha! no wonder he was so calm and so articulate. Um, I can't prove it, but it certainly suggests that the reason he had so many facts and figures and arguments to hand was he was being coached and fed throughout the interview, and Perot was not. So it was not Hillary Clinton who invented the earpiece in the ear during a debate. It goes it goes way back, but back in 1993, we were not as sophisticated as an audience. You know, there's no internet and no social media to share um, things people observed on. But I only noticed it second time around that Al Gore was wearing this
Well,
earpiece. I mean,
I mean, if Al Gore cheated, certainly CNN would have reported it, right? Because they're a news
oh,
organization.
they had to see that earpiece, and they didn't say a thing about it. And one of the things that really angered me was after the broadcast, the comment news commentators were saying that Al Gore had clearly won the debate. They made fun of Ross Perot, and they said that um, Al Gore had eloquently debunked the arguments against NAFTA, showing how it would prosper America. And then, of course, NAFTA was signed into law later that year, 1993, by Bill Clinton. Um, and then following that, there was the GATT debate. This is what got us into the World Trade Organization. Beyond that, Mexico and Canada, the whole world, we were not going to have free trade with. And I actually recorded those debates on old VCR equipment. And uh, uh, I saw the same, what at one time had been a mysterious contradiction, which there were conservatives and liberals on both sides of the GATT debate. It is very, very interesting. Now, the most conservative, by survey, the most conservative congressman in the House of Representatives was Phil Crane of Illinois.
Hmm.
And he was totally pro GATT. I presume he was also pro NAFTA, but he argued strongly for GATT. On the other hand, the most conservative senator was Republican Jesse Helms of North Carolina. He was totally anti-GATT. See, he'd awoken to the realities what the
Hmm.
deep state was after. Um, Phil Crane had not. Now, at the same time, the Democrats were divided. I mean, Al Gore, Ted Kennedy, the liberal Democrats were pro-GATT, but also Democrats and liberals like Congressman Marcy Kaptur and Ralph Nader were anti-GATT, and it was a strange alliances that had formed, which normally you never saw. You're talking about abortion or school prayer. I mean, the Republicans and the Democrats would be in teams against each other like cats and dogs, but there was this great confusion about NAFTA and GATT. Um, it just depended whether or not people had awoken to the realities that William J. Gill had pointed out. But one group that had no divisions was the deep state. They wanted NAFTA to definitely and GATT to definitely be signed into law for the reasons which we outlined earlier. One of the things I found ironic. I can't find this statement now, but I know he said it. Senator Bob Dole, he's the minority leader of the Republicans in the Senate. He stood next to Bill Clinton as Bill Clinton signed the World Trade Organization, or joining the World Trade Organization into law in 1994. And I remember Dole bluntly stating, he said, it seems like 97% of the letters I get from my constituents oppose this treaty. And I'm sure that was just a raw guess on his part, 97%. But it proved that his constituents overwhelmingly opposed the treaty, yet he voted for it. And what is a senator supposed to do? He's supposed to represent his constituents. Why do you vote against 97% of the people you represent? And I mentioned this to William J. Gill, this comment by Bob Dole. And he called him Beltway Bob, the banker's bellhop.
Oh yeah, and I'm sure Archer Daniel Midland, was a big donor to his political career. And
Was it? I'm sorry. Who was a big donor?
ADM, Archer Daniel Midland, who was a big corn producer, who I think they benefited greatly from NAFTA because they were able to dump all their surplus corn in the Mexican markets, which destroyed
Wow.
Mexican agriculture, which contributed greatly to the great diaspora, Mexican diaspora, in the late 90s. We see that today in America because it disrupted all that local agriculture, you know, and also
Right.
sent them into the factories near the border there, which the infamous factories there at, you know, on the U.S. Mexican border there.
Right. Exactly. And
Juarez, that Ciudad Juarez, that area, so.
oh, yeah. Well, at one time, of course, well, just getting to the lies that Al Gore told, saying that NAFTA and GATT were going to prosper America. You know,
Mhm.
Michigan was once a very prosperous city. It was a center of American car manufacturing, but after NAFTA passed, they started moving factories down to Mexico, as you're pointing out,
Mhm.
and now Detroit is plagued by a lot of poverty and a countless number of housing units that are unoccupied. And this could be said for industry across the board in America. You feel free to interrupt me at any time. But I just wanted to mention that William J. Gill, um, just a tremendous patriot. He spent all the last years of his life trying to save the American economy. And not only did he write his book, which there's an interesting insight into his book I'll give you momentarily, but he was the president of the American Coalition for Competitive Trade. He put out a regular newsletter opposing the free trade agreements. And man, he was in his 70s, and almost literally to the day of his death, he was pounding the pavement in Washington, talking to congressmen about saving America from these treaties. What a great guy! What a great patriot! Um, but what I wanted to mention about his book, Trade Wars Against America, which came about in 1990, he came to me and he said, Jim, my publisher, which is named Prager, the publisher had betrayed him. Um, the book was fabulous. It dispelled all the myths about free trade, that a number of which I've mentioned earlier in this interview. The book was not that long, 324 pages, but Prager set the sales price at $50. Now, that would be like selling a book for over $100 today. Prager, the publisher, made the book unsaleable. And he just was so sad about this. If Americans had been able to read that book, it could have really turned the tide, at least to some degree, against NAFTA and joining the World Trade Organization. But the book was unbuyable. And it was only after Mr. Gill died in 2008 that I learned from the internet that Prager is basically controlled by the CIA. So it looks like what happened was the CIA pulled a fast one on Mr. Gill. They, without him knowing that the CIA, they offered him a publishing contract. They gave him a nice cover design, a beautiful interior layout, and then let the book not sell by pricing it out, making it unbuyable at
Yeah.
$50 a copy.
Mhm.
1990, that was a lot of money. Um, so he had no idea that the CIA had stymied him working. The CIA was working and the publisher working for the deep state. Uh, anyway, throw it back to you. I want to talk about Trump's tariffs next, but let me just see if you have any other comments
Well,
before.
yeah, free trade sort of became a mantra of the right, particularly in the Reagan era. Reagan gave a lot of rhetorical support to free trade, but he himself imposed quotas. I think a lot of reasons why so many people, Americans drive SUVs is because he put quotas on Japanese trucks coming into the country. And so when they got around the quotas, they created the SUV, from what I understand. But this is again, the contradiction or the problem with free trade is uh, in theory, you can understand the theory behind it is you obviously increase the labor pool and you increase the availability of goods, lower price, and that creates prosperity. And but the problem is with trade, there's always a trade-off. There's trade, and so every time you rely on a foreign source, whether it's food or goods or parts, you're essentially becoming dependent upon them. And your dependency is based on the degree to which or the amount at which you import from them. So while you may be getting things at a lower price. It comes at a cost of independence. And also, it creates a situation where you are then entangled in a lot of foreign disputes because you rely on the sea lanes being free, or you have business interests abroad, and this entangles the U.S. government, the American people, in many foreign disputes or problems that otherwise wouldn't be, because if you just had a domestic market, you could maintain George Washington's idea of no entanglements and just friendly alliances,
Right.
and the practicality of say financial independence or national economy or autarky really depends on the scale of your economy. Meaning, the larger the country, the more viable autarky is. The smaller you are, the less viable it is. But if you're an island nation, free trade is going to cost you a lot because you have very little resources, very little labor, and so basically, the larger the country, the more independent one can be. So you get a certain scale, then you can create a viable independent economy and create a sovereign nation. You can within that domestic market. That's if you develop a national economy of a government that actually recognizes that there are distinct people under who are governed, who identify with that nation. It's their country, it's their fatherland, if you will, their motherland, if you will, and the government has interest in supporting the welfare of the people. They can develop an economy much like what Germany did in the late 19th century, and or what America did in the 18th century to a large extent. Develop itself. It's a large enough economy they can develop on its own. The cost is you are cutting yourself off in cheap goods overseas, but the price is you establish independence, and then you can invest in your people and infrastructure. But that's something that America doesn't do anymore, because America looks at everything like it's just a shopping mall, an economic zone. It doesn't really see itself as a functional country anymore. It's been disintegrated largely through the ideology, or at least the policies and the consequences of so-called free trade, which is just globalism. It's dumping cheap goods on American economy, eroding its industrial manufacturing base, eroding its middle class in the process, its core constituency, which is the heritage Americans, which means the American system, that system, the company, the country disintegrates, as we're seeing today. It may exist in name, but it no longer functions as like an American state anymore. There's no American. There's People have a hard time identifying who the American people are now. You know, which is probably one of the objectives of David Rockefeller to begin with. So uh, my compliments to David Rockefeller and company. They got what they wanted.
Yeah, they really accomplished their purposes very effectively, and they tricked a lot of conservatives into backing their plan against the conservatives' best interest.
Yeah,
Not
I liken it to like doctrine of human rights in the world court, where the doctrine idea of human rights can be used for globalism, because you need at any given day around the world, there's someone, quote, being oppressed, or there's some situation in some other country that's going
Mhm.
to pull on our heartstrings and look bad, or become a pretext for intervention. Whether it's I don't know, female genital mutilation or circumcision in Africa, or where women being forced to cover their faces in the Muslim, something like that. There's always some pull to human rights, right? In Africa, there's endless pretext for intervention in Africa, really, because it's such a troubled continent. But it's that itself, the people advocating that they're not usually, they're doing that because they want to get access to controlled cheap minerals in Africa, or something, rare earth metals. And the Civil
Right.
War is the pretext. Okay, so it's almost like human rights becomes the pretext, the doctrine of human rights and these things, and it becomes a pretext for creating transnational, supranational, sovereignty violating institutions, treaties that entangle the country. Constant, good example, like in the Middle East and Israel. It's a great example of the country being pulled into a conflict that really doesn't serve the interests of the American people, at least 98% of the American public. But it's almost like that, just these universal claims, whether it's universal free trade, cosmopolitanism, universal human rights. The practical effect is, in order to have that, the only way those can be enforced would be constant intervention, constant warfare. So the only way you guarantee global peace is you're at constant warfare. The irony of it all,
Well,
right?
well, that's certainly been the case. I guess what you're saying is that World War One wasn't the war that ended all wars.
No, it wasn't war for democracy. It wasn't, it's But again, it's one of these claims where again, it's an argument for global homogenization, right? Because in order to get free trade, you have to like level everything because you have cultural impediments to free trade, right? Because there's some country out there that women don't have access to abortion 24/7, 24 hours a day, right? There's one society that's more traditional, and the women are oppressed because the women aren't equal. They're not going to universities or something. There's endless pretext to intervene somewhere. Afghanistan, women aren't allowed to study to become engineers in Afghanistan. There's no STEM program in Afghanistan. Think about that. We have to go in and give them STEM programs. That's how crazy it is, right?
I'm sorry, so you said,
we were actually doing that for 20 years in Afghanistan. That's not a joke, by the way. Trying to teach science to Afghanistan.
Sorry, you said STEM programs? STEM programs?
Yeah,
I'm not sure what I'm not sure what a STEM program is.
oh, that's
Sorry.
like science, technical. It's like science and math, promoting
Oh,
hard
okay.
sciences. And so it's they know somewhere in some benighted country in Central Asia, women don't have opportunity, and it's a job of the United States to go in there and give them opportunity because human rights. And of
Well,
course, then
they had opportunities, before the fall of the Shah
well, there's
in
that. Yeah,
1979.
yeah,
I consider that the first, the creation of the first Islamic theocratic state, and that was, the Shah was pushed out of power by Jimmy Carter.
yeah. Of course, then the
Uh,
Shah was reinstalled because we wanted for the oil companies in 54,
well, less
53.
vague. In '53, they were for the Shah, but then they
Yeah,
turned against him in the '70s.
yeah.
Um, it didn't help when he told Mike Wallace that America was run by the Jews. Um, you can find that
He
interview
also
on,
he, he also said that the oil shocks that he raised the price of oil as well. Kissinger told me to do that.
right. Kissinger. I wrote an article for the New American back in 2009 called um, uh, Iran and the Shah, What Really Happened. And I quoted one of his ministers named Nabahandi wrote a book about it, saying that the American idea to depose the Shah began with Henry Kissinger. Of course, Kissinger was nominally a Republican, but it was actually carried out by Jimmy Carter, a Democrat. They did
Yeah.
everything they could to push Carter out of power. And as much as we talk today about supporting Israel and the potential for war with Iran, it was us who knocked the Shah out and put that, Ayatollah Khomeini into power in '79.
Hmm.
Um, and again, that article can be on the Shah and Iran, what really happened, can be found on the internet. You look for it on the New American website.
Yep.
But
And that
actually, Empress Farah read that article, the Shah's wife, and she requested 8 hard copies, and the article was really originally a hard copy, 2009.
well,
Um,
it certainly gave the storming of the embassy in November '79 was the pretext for seizing all those assets that Chase Manhattan Bank was able to keep because at the time it was like I don't know $500 million in assets, a lot of money back then, 1979. But
sure.
to this day, I think they still have those assets.
Yeah, well, all of this is integrated into the ultimate satanic goal of you and I know that the Antichrist wants to rule, to govern the world, and to govern the world, you need a world government, and it's all leading us down that path that the Bible predicts. But I wanted to talk a little about Trump's tariffs. Um, Trump said that under his tariffs, quote, jobs and factories will come roaring back into our country. You see it happening already. We'll supercharge our domestic industrial base, end quote. Um, now you'd think that I'd be jumping for joy because I've been talking throughout this interview, as I do in my article, as being very pro-tariff, as
Hmm.
protecting our American way of life. But the reason I'm not jumping for joy over what Trump's doing is what William J. Gill said more than 30 years ago. Um, he said that, and this is the time of the NAFTA and GATT debates. He said the time to stop these free trade treaties is now. He said once our industries have been wiped out, then a long time from now, trying to rebuild these industries from the ground up is going to be next to impossible. And I think he's right. Now, when I was growing up in New England, I'm still in New England, but when I was growing up in New England in the 60s and 70s, we had shoe factories all across New England,
Hmm.
and they made millions of shoes every year. But today, 99% of the shoes we buy in stores are made overseas. Now, I know a lot of Trump supporters think that if we just put a big tariff on foreign-made shoes, that the shoe industry will be reborn in America. But think about it, the shoe factories, some were destroyed, the others were turned into shopping malls or housing residences. You'd have to,
Casinos
yeah, because
turn in.
yeah, yeah, you'd have to rebuild the factories. And how about the workers who had the know-how to make shoes? They're all gone after all these years. Um, and it's just it's basically too late. We've become dependent on foreign goods, and trying to rebuild these industries could take years, and you'd have to find entrepreneurs willing to put up millions of dollars to restart these industries that were destroyed. It's not just shoes, it's electronics and textiles, and quite a few industries were destroyed by NAFTA and GATT. And and we talked about the automotive industry. Um, yeah, there may be some good effects from Trump's tariffs, but it's not going to be easy. And this Nobel Prize winning economist, his name is Joseph Stiglitz, who I quoted, he points out that even if they do start building factories in America for industry, that probably most of the manufacturing will be done by robotics instead of people. So actually, it still wouldn't create jobs now that we're into the era of AI, which is something Mr. Gill couldn't have foreseen 30 years ago.
Hmm.
Um, uh, so I I'm not confident about Trump's tariffs. If I've heard that some more examples that we make drones in America, but 90% of the parts for drones are made in China. And if we had a trade war with China, do we have people with the know-how and the ability to create factories and make these drone parts? And I've heard that the toy industry is very dependent on uh, China. Unfortunately, we've created a dependency through these treaties that are over 30 years old now, and trying to rebuild these industries, which may take years, while facing retaliatory tariffs by Americans who are out of work or suffering economically, may be too much. We may be thrown into a great recession. So I'm not that confident, even though I'm pro tariff. I just think we're doing it too late. It's just as Mr. Glue, I'd love it. Mr. Glue was still alive to get his opinion on Trump's tariffs, but I think as he predicted, it's too late at this point, Tim.
Yeah, in effect, closing the barn door after the horse got out, right? Um, the problem with that is Trump's there's a lack of coherence or clarity in Trump's policies, particularly with his foreign policy, because he's maintaining the U.S. intervention as part, particularly with Israel. And in order to carry out this policy successfully, sort of reshore the U.S. economy, kind of a reversion to a hemispheric policy as opposed to imperial policy we've been in since the end of the Second World War, he has to make all those policies cohere, and it's not possible because of the political realities of the Jewish lobby, Zionist lobby, the you could say so the business lobby itself, Wall Street, and the banks that they're against it. There's the bond market, right? Which, but the bond market is dependent upon people purchasing U.S. debt, which is reliant on U.S. dollars accumulating overseas and having people like China buy the debt. So unless you get the U.S. government's fiscal house in order, which no one seems to be able to do, we have a 35, $36 trillion national debt. No one wants to seem to get spending under control. At the same time, the type of policies that are going to yield any benefits, say in 15, 10, 20 years, which it would take, requires an approach to politics which the United States currently isn't configured to do, because every day there's a poll. There's the midterm elections. Will he lose control of the Senate and House in 2026? Will he be impeached in these things? So sort of the national policy, we're not really geared to. The United States isn't really geared to or configured to provide, because you need a leader who's going to do this and with a clear vision. And right now there is no clear leader. And in effect, Trump was elected to be a leader. I thought a lot of people voted for him to be a leader, sort of cut the Gordian knot. Him arresting, his administration arresting some of these renegade treasonous judges is a good sign. He's acting. He's penalizing his enemies, which you have to do to get control of the border. One thing you could do with policy-wise, you could you'd have to the same time you're reshoring, you have to carry out a policy of mass deportation. All the illegals have gotten into the country the past 30 years. That means kicking out 20, 30 million people. That's a long-term policy. You need personnel to do that. You could hire people to do that, but are people politically willing? Look at these judges. Our judiciary system is crammed full of commissars who are dedicated to stopping any pro-American policies. And that's a structural problem. Congress doesn't represent the American people anymore. Congress doesn't do anything anymore. Why is Trump raising tariffs? I always thought that was Congress's job to vote on tariffs.
I was gonna
It's a
make
tax
that point.
policy. Yeah.
Uh, Trump is doing things through executive orders,
Yeah.
and as the founding fathers envisioned it, laws were to be made by the legislature, the Congress.
Mm-hmm.
Legislate, and basically the role of the president was to sign a bill into law or to veto it, and that can be overcome by a 2/3 vote of the Congress. But he's not supposed to be making the laws. And the problem with Trump, and this is the problem with Biden and the Democrats too, is all these executive
Yeah.
orders. Trump, for example, signed an executive order banning males from participating in girls' sports. Well, I think I'm in favor of that. Um, but the problem is that if you don't do it through the Congress making it a law, if you don't work with Congress, and then the next president's a Democrat, he can just write an executive order that
Yeah.
overturns it right away.
And this is the
So
problem with reshoring, because who's going to invest in factories? The long-term investment that would require if an executive order can change it. And this is the problem with the political system, where you're dealing with with our democratic system. It's not, and the American people will have to be willing to take it on the chin. Meaning, if you're going to make a correction for 30, 40, 50, 60 years of bad economic policy, there's some pain is going to have to be suffered. You could do things like many of the people who have profited greatly off cheap labor, like corporations who have exploited cheap labor, maybe they should be penalized and made to pay out. A wealth tax, do away with income tax, impose a wealth tax to sort of punish the plutocrats. But then again, the so-called libertarians and capitalist advocates would be opposed to that, because that's communism. It's
right,
because
the same type of confusion that occurred over free trade, right?
yes, yeah,
Right,
they don't
yeah.
understand. Free market is a fantasy. Free trade is a fantasy. You simply can't exist in our fallen world, because there's just the complexities of overseas we can't really control for or understand. And we saw that with how the rhetoric of free trade was manipulated to allow these plutocrats, these people who run these companies, to deindustrialize the country and tap into the exploited labor of the third world to make and then pocket the profits, without any regard to the effect of their home country, because they don't see themselves, they're cosmopolitan. They don't see themselves as being particularly American, despite the
Well,
fact that their wealth and their companies were based on the American state, their corporate charters. Many of them were greatly capitalized during the Second World War, given billions of dollars to build factories, and they made a whole lot of money building bombers and tanks to destroy Europe. Which made them rich after the war, because no one else could produce goods anymore. So for 20 years, their goods dominated the planet. And then when they pocket
right,
that money, they start in the 70s and 80s, they start deindustrializing and outsourcing. You know, that's
right.
a broader picture. Most people don't look at it that way. They look at it episodically, or don't, and
I
then
would say that Satan has the broad picture in
yeah.
mind, and that's
And you
why.
mentioned a good thing is our capital stock, not just our factories, our people. Think about that. I kind of alluded to earlier, talking about the moral effect of the FIRE economy and the fact that Americans have been alienated from real productive work. How it has sort of made America very effeminate. The promotion of feminism, where women have flooded the labor market, meaning that they're not home raising kids, putting the same investment in the kids and preparing meals. This has led to a obesity health crisis in the country. All this stuff is related. It's all
Right.
all, but how do you reform it? Because in order to get this economy back, sort of this, to reverse the decadence, to get back to real work and real effort and these things, that's a very masculine approach to things. Um, how do you get back to that when people, people have been told that, we're all equal and we can it's a sign of progress for everyone to be participating to buy houses and these things, particularly single women, but it's very disruptive to society. A good example is, let's say with an executive order, Trump starts using, making coal usable for energy. So a coal company is able to go back into business. They go into formerly like a town in West Virginia, and they said, we need 2,000 coal miners, but there's no coal miners around anymore. And what's left are either old people or young people addicted to Oxycontin or heroin, which is the
Right.
effect of the
Yeah.
deindustrialization. See, this is what you're the destruction of the capital stock, which is the people themselves. I'm put it in economic
Right.
terms. How do you reverse
Right.
that? And then you got to address the social, moral issues, which everyone, you have the relationship between male and female and family, what roles men have, women have. You're going to step on a lot of toes because they've been indoctrinated into thinking that women don't necessarily have to be mothers. Not everyone has to be a mother, but if most women don't want to be mothers, what's going to happen to your population? Well, we'll just fill the breach with foreigners, which is what they're doing, right? Bringing in infinity Indians or people from the Asian subcontinent or from Latin America. Then your country's gone. And if you notice that there's a problem with this, they call you a racist for your trouble.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they talk about white privilege and et
Hmm.
cetera, et cetera. This is all goes back, of course, to the Kalergi plan. And um, in my 2013 book, um, Truth is Only Warrior, I have a short section in there on the dangers of immigration in Europe. And it's actually on with one very popular uh, podcast host who had read the book and he was very angry about that. Because he was an immigrant himself and he saw that as insulting. But I think that actually the situation has grown so much worse since I wrote that book in 2013. Um, Europe, England, Ireland, all the countries of Europe, Germany, France, Italy, they're all suffering under the economic oppression of having to support these illegals as we are in America. And in my state of Massachusetts, we previously had a Republican governor. We had a state surplus. Now that's gone under our lesbian governor, Maura Healey, and because we're supporting all these illegals in this sanctuary state, many of them, well, I won't say many, but certainly a number of them are criminals, child rapists and et cetera. Um, and we're just bearing the burden now of immigration and the complete destruction of nationalism, which is what they want. It was God Himself who, after the Tower of Babel, separated the peoples into different languages and set up the idea that there would be distinct countries and distinct ethnicities. And years ago, Italy was Italian, and Britain was British, and Ireland was Irish, and Germany was German.
Yeah.
So, and Sweden was Swedish, and that was great. And but now, even the beauty contest, it's rare to see, a local be elected the queen of the country. It's a beauty contest.
Well, the
So,
irony is these groups, these foreigners that are brought into the country in hundreds of thousands, not millions, they're allowed to express their ethnic pride or nationalism in
right,
their host country.
right,
Like, yeah,
as in America, yeah,
yeah, and it's like, but the people who live there are not, particularly if you're German or something, right? Yeah, you cannot do that. Yeah. So basically, I mean, what's going on here? It's obvious, actually. Did you see this latest this Michigan representative Shri Thundar? He's an Indian, and he is a member of Congress, and he speaks with a thick Indian accent, and he's introduced impeachment articles of impeachment against Donald Trump. 7 or 8 charges. Only one of them is for the deportation, but this guy has no business being in the United States, much serving in the House of Representatives. He has no understanding of the American people, because the American people don't exist anymore. They disintegrated them through
Right.
free trade and multiculturalism and these things. But he's sitting up there because they've evidently in Michigan I guess they've eroded or destroyed the capital, the population of Michigan, where someone like of his caliber can be elected. He himself is worth $40 million.
Wow.
So
Okay.
whatever he is, he probably pumped and dumped some stock like Vivek Ramaswamy did, because or he probably exploited his ethnic ties and nepotism to take over businesses. There's a whole program, and there's programs in the Commerce Department, the State Department, that allow foreigners to come in and buy up small businesses away from, out from under Native, Americans, heritage Americans. Why do you want to do that? Who wants to? Why are you, And here there's a qualitative difference in how they run their business, because it's a different culture. There's a difference having a few Indians come into the country and assimilate than having millions come into the country and not assimilate and form their own little subcultures. They're creating a Tower of Babel, and that's what they've effectively done in America. They've created. That's what globalism is. It's Babel, because they
Right.
don't want any organized. They don't want any homogeneous organized political structure, because then that's a power base they have to compete with.
Right. They want to destroy national sovereignty, and
Mhm.
one way you do that is by destroying the unity of the people by bringing in foreigners who are not loyal to your flag, don't know your history, don't
Mhm.
speak your language, have a different religion. Um, it's funny if you, I don't know if you ever remember an old movie with Richard Egan called The 300 Spartans, and there's a debate in the Areopagus about how Greece should react to the Persian invasion, and the statement is repeated. Um, Unity is our strength. In other words, we as Greeks, we all have to stand together. Unity is our strength. Well, today it's the exact opposite. We're told diversity is our strength. That is an absolute lie. Diversity separates us, it divides us, and makes us conquerable and more easily absorbed into a world government.
Mhm.
Again, this is the satanic end game that they've been playing for. And this is where the Kalergi plan comes into play with Europe and America as well.
Well, even with homogeneity, there's enough diversity. There was in America always.
Right.
Virginia is very different from from people in Massachusetts and
Oh,
people,
you bet.
South
I don't
Carolina.
have to tell you, I'm from Massachusetts, but I have to tell you tops out on that one.
Yeah, you know. But the one thing what America was it's out of many one. But idea was you had these sovereign states that came together under a federal union, a confederacy, if you will, that was formed to create sort of a common market and mutual defense pact, and that was it. But even from the get-go, there were schemers like, even Hamilton, with people like the Federalists, who like John Marshall, who immediately started scheming to centralize powers. Even the Constitution itself people called it the coup in Philadelphia, right? It was a coup, and it was a conspiracy, if you will, because they actually went there to revise the Articles of Confederation. They were not given the authority to develop a constitution, but the elites had decided to unify the country, and they couldn't get away with it immediately, but they worked at it gradually, immediately from the get-go. But nevertheless, the country was functional, even up until the middle of the 20th century, because you had these
Right.
enclaves, you had regional characters and all that. You had regional identity. The Midwest was the Midwest manufacturing, agriculture, the South, the Northeast. But then in the 20th century, it was homogenized. Uh, and now it's disintegrating under the very same, I guess, elements that homogenized the country in the 20th century. The very people that tried to homogenize and do away with ethnic differences in the 20th century then weaponized ethnic differences. You go so far as to import tens of millions of illegals into the country. I guess the watershed year was probably 1965 when that decision was made with the Hart-Celler Act, and you had the some of the legislation with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights
Mhm.
Act and these things, all again ostensibly done for humanitarian reasons, extending liberty, but really creating the conditions where the social engineers could come in and take over and smash local character, local independence, and create the situation we have today, rob people of their identity, and it's always done for, remember, it's always done for good reasons, right?
Right. It was kind of ironic that Lyndon Baines Johnson was trying to fund the Great Society while simultaneously funding a war in Vietnam, and yet
Hmm.
his deficits were minuscule in comparison to what they've become today.
Yeah. Yep. So it's become just ungovernable as it is, and so now, well, again, it's uh, there's no way you could reconcile the various differences because there's so many foreign and special interests that control the government, and the last thing that the federal government is concerned with is actually the welfare of the American people.
That is very true, and we see it in so many ways from um, vaccinations uh, that are lethal to chemtrailing our skies, um, to fluoridated water, to genetically modified foods.
Hmm.
We see the elites that control our government behind the scene and who are often of a certain ethnicity. Um, we see that the government does not care about the people, and um, we see a very dark picture for the near future. Our hope, of course, is in the promises of our Lord Jesus Christ and in the Bible that we knew that it was going to be a very rough end time, but it was going to be ended. It was going to be finite. It was not going to be, as George Orwell is supposedly put, a boot stamping on the face of humanity eternally. That is not going to happen. But I think the times are still going to be rougher ahead for the American people. Tim, I really like the way you've taken my comments on free trade and integrated it into the big picture.
Yeah, it's a false promise, just like, you know, and obviously a course correction is necessary, and it's going to involve some pain and determination to stomach that pain for a period that most people aren't willing to most people are willing to accept in terms of like electoral politics, right? So it that's why you don't have a national policy to address these things. There isn't even a consensus among the government ruling class what to do with the illegal immigration issue, the illegal aliens. But again, we still that course correction is necessary, and although it's hard to foresee how it can be done, or much less it can be done without creating trouble. But then again, that the pain the pain we're seeing in from the course correction is it's almost like if you're ill or you're injured, the pain you're feeling as you're healing is necessary. If you're given a drug to cover up the pain, you're not going to heal properly. Same thing with the economy. The economy has been on a basis be given a heroin drip for decades. We got to get off that, and that withdrawal is going to be painful. How does that play out politically? Under the current political structure, it doesn't. So that's the big, what political structure, what is necessary? That's the big question. Indeed, it looks like it will take a miracle, but the good news is there is precedent for miracles, so we can pray for that and do what's right and what's necessary. That's all. I think it's all that can be reasonably asked of us.
Right. We need to, in our own lives, to work to be truthful, obedient, try to share the truth as much as we can. But we're cognizant of the fact that at this moment, we're up against an enemy that is far better financed and is in control of government, media, intelligence services, militaries, that has resources at present that we do not have access to. All that will come to a halt with the return of Jesus Christ. We also have to be on our guard that we do not accept a false Messiah, an Antichrist who disguises himself
Hmm.
as the Messiah prematurely. We must not accept such a figure as Christ, but we must be. So it is something that requires a good deal of discernment. And this is again where the education system and the media, which if so corrupted people's understanding of events, makes it very difficult for many people to have discernment about such things.
Yep. So, okay, James, think we covered it?
Yeah, I think we have. That kind of covers. I did want to clear up the mystery of why because this was something that mystified me in the 1980s, why it was that conservatives and the John Birch Society and free marketeers were in alignment with David Rockefeller and the deep state on the subject of free trade. And
Okay,
again,
yeah.
I just want to
I
say,
just thought
Simon,
that they just gave money to foundations and publishing houses to publish the propaganda to make it popular.
right. Oh, that's how they always work.
Yeah,
And I did want to give again credit to William J. Gill
yeah.
as a man who educated both Pat Buchanan and at least that's what Mr. Gill told me, and he certainly educated me on the realities of this and enabled me to see through the myths on the subject of free trade.
Well,
A
yeah,
great,
yeah. I know personally when I was, coming of age, I would read a book and thought, okay, that I'm smart. Now I read a book on free trade. Well, it makes sense, right? Competitive advantage, absolute advantage, these things, and you just it makes everyone wealthier, and just the way it works. And the world is a bit more complicated than that, you know.
right. Yeah. It was very commonly thought amongst conservatives that free trade was like free enterprise and government should not interfere through tariffs. But it was not simplistic. It was more complex than that, and you needed to discern the complexities and understand the reason why the deep state wanted free trade for reasons that we have discussed it during this
Yeah,
interview.
and so that's it gets a bit more. It isn't just a question of voluntary I mean, ideally, voluntary relationships and voluntary transactions are better than coerced transactions, if you call them transactions. But you don't really understand the whole picture of economic relations and how people's choices are often narrowed through coercion that isn't necessarily seen. A good example is promoting a civil war in said country. Then people are cleared off the land, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of cheap land that can be taken. All that surplus labor can now be hired at a factory. Can be the same way that the enclosure movement in Great Britain fed the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism itself was conceived in sin and theft out of the Protestant Reformation. And understanding that history, you get understanding why Adam Smith comes along in the 18th century to advocate free trade and capitalism, because he's serving those interests that were enriched by the Reformation and the theft of church property and the destruction of the English Commonwealth, which was which fed which created the I guess the capital for the eventual Industrial Revolution. But all that all the enclosure, all that labor that was provided, because the peasants were forced off the commons into the cities. You had the pauperism. Well, that was surplus labor that could be exploited for the factories, and it started the Industrial Revolution. But we're given a very on the right, you're given a very you receive a lot of apologia or support for the Industrial Revolution, because it created the consumer economy and eventually would produce high standard living, because you have productivity, steam applied to productivity and efficiencies and these things, these benefits. But we're not really told the true history of how that got started. How good example is how why there's so many Irish in America. Well, it's because they were starved to death in Ireland. So they,
Yeah,
yeah,
and it wasn't because the only thing they knew how to grow was potatoes.
no. But then the Irish come to America. There's cheap labor for the factory workers, or they fill the ranks of the Union Army that are able to go in and conquer the South. So again,
Well,
it gets very, it's like it isn't a question of private property and voluntary contracts and these things. Behind that, there's always coercion. And whenever you have a situation of employer and employee, there's someone who's in a stronger position. Usually, it's the employer. because he has more money and the employee is more desperate, and they can be used to exploit the employee. So what do? Well, you develop things like Catholic social thought and solidarism and these things. And these are moral checks on the marketplace, the same way that monogamy is a moral check on the sexual marketplace. It yields great rewards because it channels human desires and appetites to a productive pursuit, and it regulates them. And bottom line is, all human activity, all purposeful human activity should be guided by the moral law, and economic activity is, by definition, purposeful human activity, and that too should be guided by the moral law. And that's
Correct. Yeah.
and that applies to how you relate to your neighbors, your society. You should have a loyalty to your country. You should seek out their welfare, their benefit first before making a short-term profit, which is what globalism is all about. Is exploiting labor and maximizing profits, then using those profits to control and enslave everybody. So,
Right. I just wanted to mention that when I first did the John Birch Society, they had a pretty negative view of unions, but and I do agree that unions were sometimes infiltrated by
mhm.
communists, and sometimes they also could be overly coercive in their domination of a particular field, um, in forcing people to join unions. Nevertheless, um, you were talking about the dominance that the employer had over the employee. Unions did give um, the employee a sort of a bargaining chip,
Mhm.
um, um, sort of a voice that can compete with that of the employer in order to guarantee the rights of the worker. So I became more sympathetic to unions over time, and those two seem to have diminished in their presence, don't they? Over the years,
Yes.
especially with the eradication of the industrial base. I suppose you could say that the need for unions in many fields just vanished. I hadn't even thought about that when I was writing my
Well, because
article. But,
unions, you need solidarity. Like
right,
Poland, remember solidarity? But if you bring in
right, yeah,
diversity, you can't have solidarity. And if, again, that much solidarity is based on ethnic relations and all that, right? But
mhm,
then if you preach diversity and tolerance and you sound good, progressive, then you destroy the basis for an effective labor union, don't you?
correct, yeah,
At the same time, you get to prance around like a civil libertarian or a anti-racist guy. Look at me, I'm for diversity, treating everyone the same. So it's again, you have to look at these things and from not as a retail, but sort of what are the arterial motives? What's the second, third order consequence of these policies? And that's most people can't think in those terms. They're not trained to think
right.
in those terms, so they can,
Yeah,
but they're not trained to. Yeah.
you have to see beyond the superficial and the media interpretation of things and discern that truth, which is so cleverly hidden in so many aspects of our history and current
Well, like the
events.
basis of a high trust society is people that all get along with the same views and backgrounds, and they have the same history. Well, that by its very nature is going to be a sort of a homogeneous, exclusive community. Same way a nation state is exclusive, right?
Mhm.
It's the whole point
Well,
is
I think that's one reason why Japan is strong
yeah.
still, is that they put a tight limit on immigration, and they are an island nation, and they have a strong national identity. And I'd say they're one of the better holdouts that remains in the world against
Mhm.
integration into a world government. But that's the kind of country that God created. Um, he wanted a very diverse um, set of nationhoods with different languages and different cultures that would not try to come together again as they did under the Tower of Babel. But Satan's trying to reverse all that in his plan to integrate the world into a world government. So
Yep.
we're getting beyond our topic of tariffs, but we're looking at the big picture as you've done so well in this interview.
So, okay, James, I want to thank you for coming back on the show.
Yeah, and once again, back on so soon. It's a delight to talk to you, Tim, because you are such a well-informed man, and
No,
appreciate you
thank you.
very much and all that you're doing.
Well, it was always good to have on the show too. So thank you for coming back on. I'll let you go, and I'll post this soon, and I'll send you the link.
Okay, great. I'll look forward to that. I will repost that link as broadly as I can.
Thanks. Good night then.
Good night then.